Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to my studio. I'm glad you could join me today, but I want to first of all say a really big thank you to Central Coast Watercolor Society for making this possible. And I hope that if you're not a member of the Watercolor Society, and you live locally, that you will consider joining, because they're a very active group doing great things every month, and hopefully that will happen in the not too distant future for all of us. So looking forward to showing you today some of the good things that I'd like you to see in this method, and we'll go straight over to the table to start that. This is the subject that I gave you, or I showed you, and this is a line and wash. This is a little more complicated than I will do a complicated one today, but not quite as, something that doesn't take quite as long as this one would take. And so what I want to talk about particularly today in this idea of line and wash is why it's necessary to choose different materials and what happens when you choose different materials. Because I have a lot of ways that I work with ink. I work with Sumi ink, I work with India ink, I work with colored inks, I work with inks that bleed a little bit when they are dry. And so I'm going to introduce you to a few of those today. And if you want more, I'd be very happy to do a workshop later. If you are more interested in line and wash when we've finished, I do have some videos on my site that cover quite a lot of this material too. So you can look for those. There's a little course of videos relating to line and wash. So this particular image that we're looking at now is a pottery in France, and this is a wash and line. So this is an image where I put all of the watercolor washes on first, and then I added the line afterwards when the washes were dry. Then I added just a little bit more line in along the way at the end. One of the advantages of a wash and line is that you can pick up what the watercolor allows you to see, edges perhaps, certain little areas that vary a little bit more than you might think of when you're drawing the line. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on, but let's start right away by just going into the materials and seeing what we need to use today. So materials that we need to use, or we can use, for line and wash could be very simple, like a micron pen. That would be one possibility, and a micron pen would work. However, there are some disadvantages with a micron pen, and I'll be talking about those and showing those to you in just a moment. Let me focus in a little bit more so you can see what's happening on the page here, because this gives you an idea of some possibilities and some of the materials that I'm using. So this is a micron pen, and it's a fiber-tipped pen. Pretty good, really good for taking out, for journaling, for drawing outside. But I don't feel that it's quite as good for drawing with in ink and wash. And one of the reasons for that is because of the line quality. And I'm looking for a line quality that's interesting. I'm looking for a line quality that varies between looking a little bit like an outline and disappearing and getting lost. And I can't achieve that as well with a micron pen as I can with dip pens. And dip pens come in different forms. There's a bamboo pen that is a thicker idea of a dip pen. There are various types of pens with a medium nib, and the nibs look like this, and the holder looks like this, and you can find those in the art store. One of the advantages of a dip pen like this, and even a bamboo pen over a fiber-tipped pen, is that the nibs are flexible. And so when you press down on them, you're going to get a variation of line quality. And I'll demonstrate that in just a moment. And that's what makes your drawings more interesting. So I think that's one of the main reasons why I prefer to use dip pens and liquid inks rather than the micron pen for drawings like this. These dip pens also come in a smaller size, and I'll show you that where I've used those, this particular size, in some images in a moment. And the two sizes obviously need two different holders. So the medium-sized nibs need a larger holder, and the small nibs need the smaller holder. And so those are, most of them these days are made by Speedball. You can find those in the art store, and you can pick them up. This is a medium-sized nib. It's just one that I happen to have had for a long time. So I'm going to use that one today. So I'm going to put these to one side so you can see this image just a little more. I use this pen to make this image, which is a medium-sized nib. And I used an ink that's called walnut ink. This is what it looks like. And it's an ink that is water soluble after it's dry. So one of the advantages of that is when you put the watercolor on after the ink is dry, it tends to bleed just a little bit. It bleeds on the edges, it loosens up. It's a little freer. And I like that quality in this ink. And so one of the ways that that looks in a different subject would be like this. Okay, so this is walnut ink. It's another version of it here. So these two little images are both made with walnut ink and watercolor. And one of the advantages is that it does wash out a little bit, so it softens everything. So you're not ending up with a coloring book type image that's really, really tight. Okay, so if you like that freedom and that looseness in the line, you might want to think about using some of these inks that bleed just a little bit. The opposite to that is an ink that doesn't bleed very much, and that would be India ink right here. India ink, what you put down is what you get, and you can't move it very much at all. It's pretty much set in stone, so you've got to be a little bit more careful about where you put the line. In relation to walnut ink, which tends to bleed a little bit more when you add the watercolor and gives you a little bit more freedom. So it depends on what you're looking for in your drawing as to which one of those inks you'll prefer. I'm actually going to use India ink today in the demo, but I do like to work with walnut ink. And the size of pen that you use is going to make a difference to how your image looks too. So if you use the bamboo pen like this with walnut ink, you're going to get an image that looks something like this, or a line quality that looks something like this. So you can see the line quality is interesting, it's different. It's thick in some places, thin in other places, and I think that's what makes a really good line and wash painting. I think you've got to be really careful about making the line work first before you worry about the watercolor in line and wash paintings. So really good to have a strong drawing before you start. If I did an animal similar to that, not similar, but a different animal in a different way with the same ink and a different pen, I would get this type of effect. So the pen and the thinness of the line quality is going to affect how you work and what your image looks like eventually. And it's going to be personal. How do you like? What would you like to see? How would you like to see this work? You can see this has got very fine lines if you look very closely. You can see some of the pen lines in here. You can see where they've washed out a little bit. This is walnut ink again, one of my favorite inks to use. And you can see the difference between the two lines. You can see how this one is much chunkier and it gives more of the character of the subject, and this one is a little smoother and it describes more of the fur aspect of the subject. So I think you have to be a little bit clear about what you want in your drawing before you decide. But these possibilities are all out there for any subject. So this can be used for any subject, not just architecture, not just animals, not just people, but anything. I tend to use the bamboo pen a little more for my sumi ink drawings, where I use just a little bit of watercolor, because I think it lends itself really well to the sumi ink idea. But you'll notice when you look at this image, and I'm going to show you a little bit more of this in a second, you look at this image, you'll see that the line quality is varied. It's not exactly the same all the way through. It's thinner in some places. It's thicker in other places. It's wider. It's a little less wide. It's broken. It's interesting rather than an outline. And I think that's what the difference between line and wash with a dip pen particularly, I'm just going to move that back for a minute, and line and wash with a micron pen. So what we're looking at when we're looking at pens for drawing, so we're looking at either micron fiber tip pens, which tend to be fairly consistent in their line. I can lift it up a little bit and break it to make it a little bit lighter, or I can push a little harder. But overall, it's fairly consistent. This writing was done with this pen. So it's a fairly consistent, predictable line. Okay, and one of the difficulties with a predictable line is that you tend to get an outline around things that is pretty much the same. And when that happens, then you're getting something that I call a coloring book, where you obviously want to fill in the middle because that's where the color goes, and the line goes around the outside edge. Okay, and that's a little bit limiting. So I prefer to have line that has a slightly different quality. And so I use India ink. I'm going to show you how that works now. India ink is a black ink, very traditional black ink. I won't tip that sideways because I just took the lid off, but this comes from a large bottle and it's decanted into here. There are also black inks that are acrylic, and a lot of other manufacturers make black inks too, so it's not necessary that you use specifically India ink. When you're using ink in a dip pen, you want to dip the pen into the ink until the ink covers the reservoir. And the reservoir is the little hole on the top of the pen there. You can see that hole. And if I open it out like that, and you want to dip it in so that the reservoir is covered. Okay. And then you want to wipe off the back of the nib on the edge of the bottle. If you don't do that, your ink tends to flood into a bubble on the paper. And so dip pens with bottled inks, the nib sizes vary, as I've just explained, and the way that the ink goes onto the paper varies too. So you can have a single solid line if you want to, but you can also have a thicker line by pushing just a little harder on the nib, because the nib is flexible. And you can make it a lot thinner by turning the nib if you want to on its side. So you can vary tremendously the way that the lines look. You can scoot lines across, you can make lines a little thicker. You have a lot more freedom and variation in line quality with this type of nib, with a flexible nib. Okay, so dip pens are specifically designed to be flexible, so they give you this line quality. So it's really important that that you understand that, because that's what I think is very, very critical in line and wash. And so to clean the pen, you can probably hear what I'm doing right now. To clean the pen, I'm just going to scoot it into a little bit of water and wipe it off on a Kleenex. And there are pen cleaners that you can buy, but I've been using this one for many, many years, and I've never used a pen cleaner yet. So it seems this water seems to work really well. So that's the dip pen with India ink. Okay, and the fact that the line quality is so variable makes it really, really interesting to look at. And so I think if you start with a drawing for your subject that has good line quality before you add the watercolor, your subject overall is going to be interesting because the line is going to hold it together, and then the watercolor can be varied and doesn't necessarily have to be realistic, totally realistic. It can be loose and free. This is one with walnut ink. This is one with India ink. Same idea. Okay, so we'll look a little bit more at those later. But let's just look at a touch more at the inks that I'm going to use today. I'm just going to show you 3 inks today, and the first one was India ink up here, and that is a water-resistant ink. Okay, and so effectively that's what I've just used down here. I'll just show you a little bit more so you can see. So India ink, when it's dry, and I'll put this on here because I'm going to add a little water to it so you can see when it's dry. India ink has a lot of variety. It does take quite a while for these inks to dry on the paper. So just be a little careful, particularly when you're working in a sketchbook. Because and particularly if you're using a line drawing underneath the ink, you need to make sure it's going to be completely dry before you start to erase out any pencil. I've had that experience of the ink bleeding a little bit because it's not dry. So it does take quite a while. So acrylic inks or India inks or any of those will be water resistant when they're dry. And the other ink that I really like that I just talked about is walnut ink. And walnut ink will be water soluble when it's dry. Okay, so this is walnut ink over here. And this is going to be water soluble when it's dry. And it can be applied with different size nibs. I often use the bamboo pen for this, for the larger areas. Okay, I'm going to let this dry down while we look at some other things in a moment, and then come back and put some water on it so you can see what happens. So that's the walnut ink. Okay, and the walnut ink now also comes in with a darker medium, so you can make it just a little bit darker, because the walnut ink in general is a middle tone. It's really not a dark. And even though you can use it and layer it to make a drawing just in walnut ink, let me show you that in a minute, it's difficult to make it dark enough. So they've made a darker medium now that you can use with that. So that's a possibility. And the third ink that I'm going to show you today that I think is really helpful for drawing is Eternal ink. So this is a black ink that also bleeds when it's dry. So let's see how that looks on the paper. And that's going to look a lot like the India ink to start with, but it has a totally different quality when you add water to it. But you can see the type of line quality that we can get, the type of interest that we can get in the lines that we can't get with a micron pen. And so that's why I'm not a fan of micron pens for this type of drawing. I think they're really useful for being outside, but not so much for this. So let me just clean that up. One other thing I would caution you about is, and I've from personal experience, is that you don't use a hairdryer too close to your ink bottle, because the hairdryer has the ability to knock the ink bottle over and the ink will go everywhere. And how do I know that? Yes, that's how I know that, because it happened. Okay, so let me just put these to one side. I want to show you a few more samples while this dries, and then I'm going to show you how that tones down. Okay, so let's go back to my sketchbook here. And you've seen what happens when India ink and walnut ink are next to each other. So you see that idea. What you didn't see was what happened when Eternal ink mixes with watercolor. So this is the type of effect you're going to get with Eternal ink. So it's like a hybrid between walnut ink and India ink. It's a black, slightly bluish black hybrid. And so this would be a walnut ink version of that subject, where everything bleeds just a little bit when it's wet. This would be a black version of that subject. So if you like the idea of India ink, you like the color, you like the tone, but you prefer that it was a little looser, then Eternal ink is a really good option for that, Higgins Eternal ink. You can use it with any of the dip pens. It doesn't make any difference which one you use. So we talked a little bit about the idea of India ink. There are also colored inks that you can buy. And here I've used several colored inks. I've used a yellow ink up here. I've used an orange ink on the side here. And I've used black India ink as an outline, but also on a brush, with a brush, as part of the image. And so ink is not just, can be applied in different ways, not just with the pen. You can also use a brush to make that interesting, make that happen. This is a similar image with a blue ink instead of black ink. Same idea of using the ink in the brush form, in the trees, but colored, a little bit of colored ink in here, a bit of colored ink on the edge there, and using the blue ink down here too in the foreground. So there are lots and lots and lots of different ways to explore line and wash. Okay. Some of the inks that you buy that are Winsor Newton ink, for example, that are a sort of shellac-based, they tend to bleed just a little bit, but not very much. They will soften, the edges will soften a little bit, but they won't bleed too much. So that's another possibility too. And they are made just a little differently. Now, most of what I've shown you so far has been, apart from the first image, has been work that was done with the line first and the watercolor washes afterwards. There's a difference between using wash and line and wash. Okay, so let's just take a look at this. This is a little image that was made with washes first. So I started with a pencil drawing, and then over the pencil drawing, I put in the colors that I wanted in all of the different places. Very loosely and freely, not too tight. And then I came back afterwards and added the ink line. And I was very specific about where the ink line went. I was not wanting to outline everything. So you can see pretty clearly that I've used the ink line on the edges here, a loose broken line here, and I use this pen for making this drawing. So it's a medium-sized nib. And I'm just putting in ink where I think I can accent the subject. So when I do a line and wash, and that was just like the pottery that you saw at the beginning, I'm using the ink in a different way. I'm using it to accent the watercolor. And I'm using some of the idea of where the watercolor is lighter or darker to outline those little areas to make accents. So it's a little bit more random because you don't know what the watercolor is going to do until it happens. And then you can take advantage of those edges that the watercolor makes and add in the line. So it's a bit looser and freer. So this is what I call a wash and line image. Here's another wash and line image. This is the Morrows, a couple of the Morrows. So for this one, I put all the washes in first, and there was no line at all to start with. You can see a little bit of my pencil drawing here on the edge where I didn't take it out, and I changed it just a little bit as I put the washes in. I used the very fine pen up in the sky to make these little areas, and I used the fine pen coming down to about here, and then I moved to a pen that was just a little bit thicker, okay, and then I actually have a couple of nibs that are a little bit wider than this. They're medium nibs, but they're a little bit wider than this one, and so I use those down here. So as I came forward in the image, the line got just a little bit thicker to help the dimension of the subject. And you want to be very careful about putting too much line way back in the back of any sort of landscape like this, because it will tend to come towards the front. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go back over here now. Here's another wash and line image where all of the washes were put in first and the line added afterwards. And so it's a little freer, just a little bit freer. And here's one more, just one more of those. So on this one, I used some colored ink. The original image had brickwork, fairly regular brickwork around the outside edge of the archway, but I put some washes in and different levels of tone initially because I didn't want all of that brickwork. I wanted you to look through here and not be distracted by all of this brick around here. And so I put in a little yellow ink around here and orange ink in the background on the edges, and then I put all of the washes in, and everything else was watercolor first and line afterwards. This is India ink on the front here, and you can see how I've used the accent or the size and the shape of the watercolor wash to indicate the texture here. So it's very loose and very free, and it's basically wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the washes. So the washes have determined where the ink goes on this one. So that's kind of a nice way to go, because then you don't have to worry too much about making it too detailed. So I kind of like that idea. So you might like it too. You'll have to decide what you think you would like in your subject. So it doesn't matter what subject you're doing. It doesn't matter whether it's a jar of olives, it's an apple, it's cherries. It doesn't make any difference. These are all India ink, and you can do any subject. It doesn't make any difference with this method. You can do figures, you can do whatever you wish. So let me just put those to one side. I have a few more things to show you while those lines are drying, and then we'll get into our demonstration here. So this is India ink also. A little bit more action in the watercolor here in the sky. because I wanted to add that feeling of atmosphere in this particular one. So what I'm looking for when I'm doing ink and wash, and again, this was mostly washes first with the line afterwards. I did do a little bit of line on the building before I started, but no line in the foliage at all until afterwards. So foliage can be described very easily with line and wash just by putting the watercolor in and adding a few little accents or lines or suggestions of direction, dimension, any of those possibilities. So it's kind of fun to play with the idea that it doesn't have to all be finished in the same way. It can be varied a lot. Okay? So let me go back to, shoes make really good subjects for line and wash drawings too. Okay, let's go back to here. This is just another India ink and a brown ink, another feeling. I'm a printmaker too, and so oftentimes I like to make drawings that look like woodcut prints, and this one was one of those. And so here I use brown ink, black ink, a little brown ink back here, and then I use the ink again on the brush to make the foliage of the trees after I had put in all of the watercolor washes. So all of the washes went in first on this one, and then the ink was added afterwards on the top. And there's another version of that there. Okay, so any subject will be varied depending on whether you're using India ink or whether you're using walnut ink or an ink that bleeds as opposed to an ink that doesn't bleed. An ink that doesn't bleed will give you more of a defined outline. And if that's what you're looking for, then India ink or the darker inks, the inks that don't bleed, are good choices. This image that you saw on the CCWS invitation is India ink. And what sort of subject can you use? Well, the subject I think that works best for India ink particularly is a subject that has a lot of line. And I'm using a subject today that has quite a lot of line too, because I think then the line quality is much more interesting to appreciate. So I think that's a good choice. This is just a little French village where all of the, it's called Collonges la Rouge, where all of the buildings are made of the local red stone. So it's kind of interesting. So again, that idea of architecture is good. Bridges make good. Now this is eternal ink, and this bleeds just a little bit more. It didn't bleed out too much on this one, and I think this ink should be dry by now. So let's take a look at that. Yeah, check that that's dry. I'm just going to use a watercolor brush with some water to show you what happens. This is India ink. If I put water on it, it's not quite dry yet because it's bleeding just a tiny touch. So it's not quite 100% dry. You can see just a tiny touch of an edge there. So it does take a long time to dry, I will warn you. And this is walnut ink. And see what happens now with walnut ink. That softness, the edge disappears and you get a nice soft tone. Okay, so that's a possibility. The edge disappears more on this type of paper. I'm using hot press paper today, by the way. Hot press paper is very smooth and it won't interfere with the pen. Sometimes the pen nib can catch in the texture of watercolor paper and then spatter up on the paper. And so it's safer to use hot press paper when you're using a lot of ink work like this. But you can also use it with watercolor paper. So this is walnut ink, right? You can see what you're left with when it dries. You're left with a ghost of what you put on in the first place. This one washes out a little more than eternal ink. Eternal ink will give you a nice gray tone, a light middle tone generally, and that works pretty nicely too. And this is 140-pound paper. And I will get to your questions later if I haven't answered them yet. So please bear with me with that. So this doesn't wash out quite as much, okay, because it's a stronger ink to start with. So you'll still have more of the line showing, but you'll have a nice tone along the way. You won't get a dark tone, but there's no reason why you can't dip your brush into the ink to make a darker tone along the way. doesn't necessarily all have to happen with the pen. Okay? So India ink or acrylic inks, or there are many other ink. Noodlers is a brand of ink. Diamine is another brand of ink. You'll find that the fountain pen inks, and I do use those sometimes for sketching, the fountain pen inks are not archival, and walnut ink is probably not 100% archival, which means that they work best in a sketchbook. And if you want to do something in walnut ink that you'd like to hang on the wall, you probably need to use UV glass over it. I did have an experience one time when I used a Staedtler pen, which was like a fiber-tipped pen. I made some sketches in Rome and I hung them on the wall in the studio, and within about 6 months they had faded out to almost nothing, because most of the water-based products are not archival. Eternal ink is pretty archival. Archival just means it's going to last for longer. Okay, so just be aware of that, because it's pretty disappointing if you do some nice drawings and they go and they disappear. Okay, so now you know the materials I'm going to use today. Eternal ink, walnut ink, I won't be using today, but I'm not going to use eternal ink today. But I'm happy to do a workshop or a class. If anybody's interested, you can just let me know in any of these methods. But I just want to show you how you can use these inks in different ways in your work too. So let me show you some traditional line and wash. Okay, here's a little traditional line and wash with, I'm out in Morrow Bay now. Avila, sorry, not Morrow Bay, it's Avila. And so we've got a line drawing with watercolor washes. That's just a little bit more traditional. That's kind of what you expect to see, possibly, with line and wash. Here's a version of a subject that I like and that I've done in a couple of different ways. And this is walnut ink with washes. So the ink went on first and then the washes, and we know that because when we look at the trees, we can see how the branches washed out into the foliage, okay, and how this washes out into this area. So this is walnut ink with watercolor on top. And you can use watercolor, you can just use water, you can use anything you like, doesn't matter. This is just a little bit more traditional. Again, line and wash with India ink, which is what I'm going to do today. I'm not going to do this subject, but I will be doing a line and wash today with India ink. There we go. So something along the lines of this. So you can see that the drawing initially had a lot of interest in it. It had a lot of line work that was not complete, not like the doorway was not boxed in. And that's what I think you can do more easily with the dip pen than you can with any other type of pen. You can vary. And I really, really think that's the very important thing to do in line and wash images, because it makes them so much more interesting to look at. Okay. So this is just another little traditional line and wash, little Dalade Adobe there. My version of today would be different another day. And then the other thing you can do, if you have some watercolors that well, first of all, you can use a background and you can paint a background on watercolor paper. And then you can put your ink on the top. So this is walnut ink on a background that was just very loose. It happens to be rough watercolor paper, but it doesn't make any difference which one you use. And after the background was dry, I was looking at some images that I had, photographic images, and wondering what I could put on that background to make it look interesting. And this was the one I decided would work best on this particular background. So this is walnut ink that is drawn on and also painted on. So the brown that you see here is the ink. And then the background is, no, this wasn't plein air. This was, the background was plein air, actually, but the drawing afterwards I put on, actually in the evening of the same day that I did this. So it's kind of fun. So that idea of using a background can be done in lots of different ways. I think architecture works really well for this process of putting in, this is Froome Ranch over in San Luis. The idea of putting in the washes first over the top and this is on hot press paper, and this is India ink. So all of the washes went in first. There was nothing, no drawing on the page when I started. And then I put a pencil drawing over the top and added the ink line. Okay, so, and then a little bit of extra watercolor for shadows. So that's another option. Here's the same process with just a different subject, but the same idea. The watercolor washes went through the background, and I haven't changed those at all. The only thing I've added in watercolor after that first wash are the shadows of the subject. There are a lot of possibilities with line and wash. That's why I get so excited when I'm doing this, because it's great to play with all of these things. If you have some watercolor paintings that you think you might want to use as line and wash or wash and line, you can do that. If you find a painting that you think might work with a little extra line, and this was one of those paintings that I decided probably could use a little line. And so the line on this one, I used India ink, but I used the bamboo pen. So you can see it has a much rougher quality. And then I turned the bamboo pen on its side, and I used it for the finer lines down here. So there's a little ink under here, there's a little ink under there, and in the background to take your eye and connect your eye all the way through the painting and what's happening in the painting. So another painting that I did some time ago, I decided I could use a little ink line. This is walnut ink, but because it was on top of a painting that was already finished, I didn't wash it in. I just left it as an edge. So this is the brown walnut ink that doesn't interfere too much with the image, but you can see I added a little here, I added a little detail on the roof lines and separated out the foliage just a little bit. And it adds just a little interest to that subject. And here's one more that I added ink to. So this was a little vignette painting, and I went in and added some ink line into the trees here, and that was with the dip pen, just the regular dip pen. So I added it into the trees. I tightened up a few little lines on the buildings, but I tried not to outline them too much. I tried to give them a little bit of a looser feel and just separate out some of the foliage a bit with this. And it gave it just a touch more interest, I think, than it had before. Okay, so hopefully that's got you all excited about trying this and doing more of these. Okay, so we're ready to go on our image today, and this is the subject that I'm going to be demonstrating for you. It's a little view of the harbour at the end of Morrow Bay, behind the rock going up towards the end. And I thought it was a good image for line and wash work because it has a lot of possibilities for line and a lot of interest in the image itself, and enough interest to be able to simplify the watercolor washes too. And so I have that one finished, and I'm going to do a version of that. It might not be exactly the same, but it'll be similar when we've finished. My source material for that was a photograph that I took out there some time ago that had a lot of information. Now, oftentimes also something that's kind of important is that when you have a lot of white line work in an image, it's not always possible to do that with ink unless you use white ink, and then it gets a little, doesn't quite work if you use white and black ink together in the same way. So what I often do with things like that is to flip the white into black. I change it completely. And so you probably didn't notice too much, but on this one, I have the railing in black instead of in white. Okay? So that just makes it a little easier. You don't have to worry too much about how that's going to work. And it also simplifies it a bit too, because it's a lot of line to do and a lot of busyness that can be simplified down to a darker area. Okay, so I started with a drawing. The drawing actually that I started with on this one was a little bit looser but I put pretty much everything in here, but I'm going to leave a lot of it out. I'd rather have too much information in the image than too little information. So I'm going to use the India ink. I'm putting this in the top of the ink in the tray here, and I'm going to hope that this doesn't get knocked over. I always seem to have a problem with ink at some point or other with it tipping over, so let's hope that doesn't happen today. Let's just check the ink and make sure that's working well on the pen. Remember, you dip it in, right, and then you wipe it on the back of the bottle. Otherwise, it's going to flood in a pool, in a puddle, almost as soon as you touch the paper. So, and you can see how easily it flows on the hot press paper. I hardly have to touch it onto the paper and it's there. With the watercolor paper, not quite so much. Okay, so I'm going to start right away with the idea of wanting to have an area in the background that is hills like this, but I don't want the hills outlined, and I don't want anything that feels like a coloring book idea. And by coloring book, I mean something defined like this, okay, with edges that are defined. I'm looking for an edge that's broken, so I'm going to turn my pen on the back and I'm going to loosen up that outside edge. And with these dip pens, you can get a much finer line by doing that. So that's one of the big advantages of having a dip pen. So it's a little scary to start on watercolor paper, on white paper, with this, because you can't take it off when you're finished, or if you make a mistake. So I'm just going to check it on here to make sure it's doing what I want it to do before I put it on the background with a nice light little suggestion of just the outline of this. This isn't important. This is just the background that's going to support everything else that I'm doing. This can be, as I come forward, it can be just a little bit stronger. You see how that's getting just a little stronger? And a little stronger still as it's coming in here, but again, not too much, because when I'm looking at my subject here and thinking I'm coming in from the side, and I want just a little light line back there for this one. I've adjusted this just a wee bit to fit my idea of what I want. So I'll put a few of these little rocks in here. This is an 8x10, by the way. I really don't think that line drawings, unless you're doing a wash and line, I think the smaller drawings actually look more interesting, and they're certainly easier to handle initially. So I'll just add in a few little suggestions of the rocks in that area. And we need an edge against the water there for that shape. So I'm very, very careful not to do consistent lines unless I know I want a consistent line. Here's a little bit of line in the water here that is a little bit more consistent. And remember, it takes longer for these to dry, for this line to dry. So I'm starting at the top so I don't end up with putting my arm in something that, or my hand on something that isn't dry yet. So make this edge just a little stronger down here, and most of this is going to be black. Sorry, the posts, or the all of the white areas that you see in the image here. I'm switching to black. I'm changing all of the masts to a darker tone, and that's a choice, an artistic choice, and you can make those as and when you wish. We put in a few little suggestions of what could be buildings on the hill there. That's all we need for that. We don't need too much. It's not about this, it's about this. Okay, so I'm very carefully making it about this part of the subject. And even this is going to be diminished a little bit, because I really want you to look here first, and then here, and then maybe at everything else. So I'm trying very hard to make that happen. And having a good idea of where you're going and what you want is useful. So I think we can come down here now and have a few little boats in here. Let's have some those. Again, no detail because it's not necessary back here. It's too far away. This is Artistico, Fabriano Artistico hot press, but I think Arches works just as well for that idea of hot press. They're pretty similar. And you could also use a 300 pound if you wanted to. If you're doing a much larger piece, that would be possible too. Let's just add in a little post in there while I'm there. Come back and add those other posts in afterwards. Okay, now we're going to start working on the building a little bit. A few little goodies on the top of the building here that I didn't draw in, that I can see. Not quite sure what they are. A slightly larger version of this, so I can look at that a little bit more closely. Not quite sure what these are, but they're little details that are useful. Make a line that isn't too strong up here. And again, I'm breaking the line. I'm trying not to do a consistent line anywhere because, again, I think it's more interesting to look at. So we'll just give this suggestion outline here. And then I'm going to darken a lot of this and add a lot more detail to the drawing before I add the watercolor washes. So it's not just going to end up the way it is right now. Let's have a touch over here. Now you can leave the watercolor, the drawing in if you want to when you do the watercolor, or you can take it out. It doesn't matter. It's probably going to disappear anyway. I used a 2H pencil for this drawing. That's why it's looking a little pale. And that way I can leave it in if I want to and not have to worry about erasing it because it's not going to be too invasive. And that's a good idea for watercolor if you don't like the line, the pencil line, in your image in general, to move to a harder pencil. A 2H or a 4H pencil will give you a softer line, and it will also erase out a little more easily than the 2B that we normally use. Again, focus on these little areas. Make that just a little bit bigger, just because we can. And so on these just a little bit more. There's all sorts of stuff here, and I've left out a lot of it in this area because I just want to capture the feel of this subject. So I'm not, I'm going to go in just a bit closer so you can see what I'm doing here as well. So I'm not including everything that I saw in the photograph, and I'm simplifying a lot of the things that are there. I'm just putting in details that I think would add to the situation and what's happening in the picture just a little bit more. Bring that down, that down. So this is just the first layer of ink. And I don't always get it straight. If it's not straight, well, it's drawn by hand, and that's what we're looking for. I'm okay with that idea of having it look like it's interestingly drawn. Okay, I'm going to stop there with that railing for the moment. This one I'll just make a little bit more interesting as it goes across there. And there's another one of those on the side, right there. It's just tiny little details that add to the drawing that I put in. Shapes shapes that are a bit more interesting. Now these aren't always straight, these bollards that you see here, so we'll angle those just a little bit more, give them a bit more life. Right now it's kind of an outline, but I'm going to come back and add in lights and darks to these with the pen before I start to do the watercolor. I just have to figure out where the bars are here. Go across this one and this one. Okay, just get those going through there. One of the joys of India ink is it's difficult to erase. However, should you need to erase something, there is a way to do it. And the way to do it is to use a craft knife like this. And you can only take out small areas. But if you use the back side of the craft knife, you can erase out a little bit of stuff that you might not want. It's a little bit easier on watercolor paper that is not hot press, but you can see that you can take out lighter lines. You can lighten the darker lines, and you can take out lighter lines, and you can erase them out, and you can almost make them disappear. Okay, on the regular watercolor paper, you can pretty much make them disappear because the surface is more varied. So all is not totally lost if you make a mistake. Okay, let's see if we can get this one a little straighter there. That's going to go all the way down. And we have another little bar up here, just a little edge. The hard part with something like this is figuring out what's light and what's dark when you actually come to paint it. There's some sort of worn out area of wood here that has a funny shape. So we'll put that in because that's kind of fun. There are some goodies on there that we can add in along the way. I think it's rope that's just tied around these. We can just put in as a little accent. It's not on all of them, it's only on some. Again, that's light. It could be light if you want it to be, or you could make it darker. It's going to be up to you when you do that. I'm going to move over here so I don't put my hand on something I've already done over there. And I think we might need just a tiny touch of suggestion of water in here. And just a little bit back here too, just the tiniest amount. And as we come forward, the water can start to get just a little bit more interesting. Okay, just a touch stronger. So I'm moving my pen backwards and forwards to make that happen. And to me, it's all about the line. Okay, so I really want the line to be the focus of this painting more than the color, more than the washes. That's the whole point of doing this, is to make it interesting. And quite often I will, when I finish the line work, I'll scan that into my computer to, if I decide to make another one of these, I will have the line idea or what I decided to do this time, and then I can change it a little bit next time. So it just saves a little time when I'm doing a lot of different paintings. Something sitting on the wall here, angled against the wall, that we can add in just for interest. And it might be easier to turn everything around this way. To do these, the dog. way. So whatever works for you, you can do that. Okay, there are some little lamps coming out here. There's another little one coming out here. And there's another one coming out in this direction. I think. They are now, even if they weren't before. Okay, back to this side again. Just a little bit more going on down here. It's a nice little pot there sitting on the side that is useful as a shape. You can add a little shadow to that. That will work nicely. Now I know this is going to be darker, so I'm going to start now darkening this a little bit. Got two little edges in there, and one of them is going to be just a little bit darker than the other. So get that working already. This edge here is the top of the walkway next to the boat, and that boat's going to have a little rope coming down to that area. So the walkway is going to be about here. So a suggestion of that being dark already, going up there, and this being dark too. This is going to have its little edge here. So things that are going to end up dark, you can start by helping them a little bit. And when I finish, this boat will be cut off just a little bit, but I'm going to paint it and draw it complete. And when the mat goes on, it will be cut back just a little bit. Okay, and that's going to be darker, we know. So we can start with that idea, darkening it a bit. Bring it over the top. And I'm using this idea of the movement. Instead of putting my pen on and doing this, I'm using this line movement where I'm just touching and I'm doing little lines and then linking them together to get just a little bit more interest in the line quality again. Because for me, that's what it's all about. It's all about how interesting the line is looking. And it should feel like a hand-drawn image, obviously. So that's why I make the drawing a couple of times rather than draw this directly. Then I can choose how much of that information I want to put in to make that happen. So one of the things that I'm going to focus on a lot is the idea of the little dark corners in pretty much everything that I'm drawing here. It's amazing how much ink these pens hold, you notice? As I said that, of course, it runs out. But they go on for a long time, which is good. Okay, if I know this is going to be darker, then I'm going to add in just a little dark edge there to start with. Just a little detail back there. And a detail on the side here. Okay, we've got these bars going back here. I can just do those solid because that's kind of where they're finishing from over there. Just a few little details of signs and goodies. I'm not quite sure what they are. There's a ton of stuff going on there, and we don't want to incorporate all of that. It's too much, way too much. And this comes down here just a little bit more. And there's more of this idea going through there. And that's really what it is, it's stuff. And so that's what I'm looking for, is ideas of things that will make it look like the area that it is. It's not very straight, but we won't worry about that. Okay, we're going to take a little break in a few minutes when I've finished putting in this, to let this ink dry down a bit. And then I'm going to come back in, put a tiny bit more ink in before I come to do the watercolor. Once you've got the ink in, that's really holding the image together. And so it's not as important to have as much watercolor going on. So the watercolor can be a lot more minimal for this. It's not necessary to have it be too. I'm going to stop that one right there, just because we can. This one coming across here, and bars coming down there to connect up with what's happening over there. Okay, now in here I'll just do a few goodies because a lot of this stuff is going to be darker, and there's just a little bit of information in here that we can add in, a few little shapes that we can put in the back there before that becomes dark. And here we'll just have an edge on the railing, just have that come to one side. Not too much more in there. We need just a tiny bit of, there's a ladder back here that might show up a little bit, so we can put that in. And just a few little goodies in here. And it's really just shapes, and shapes of boards, shapes of angles. Doesn't have to be too detailed, doesn't have to be too perfect. It's all going to be in shadow, so we're not worried too much about that. And just a couple of ideas of this coming down here, another one of those coming in the back, and a couple more posts coming down there. And I think we're pretty much good to go with this for that first layer of ink. Just a little bit of suggestion of water in the foreground, so let's move that in. And the waves are kind of going in this direction, so that's why I'm using my pen in that way. Again, they seem to be going more in this, a little bit in this direction on this side too. And then I'm going to go in here and put in some of the masts for the boats. windows are just going to be black instead of white, as I said, because that's kind of what happens with an ink drawing. It's a good idea if they actually match up with the boats that are underneath. So I'll make that happen a little bit more. There's a mast coming down there. And that one can go just a little taller. Okay, now we just have this center one to do, which is what it's all about. Rough bar says there are some waves, and it's a warning. So that's what that's really about. And then we'll take our little break. This is a light line, so I'm going to turn my pen backwards again just to get that feeling of a little bit of line in there. And the horn, of course, will be there. Line down here. And I think we're almost good to go on that one. Okay, so already I feel that I've got a little interest in the drawing, and I'm happy with that so far. And I will add a few more goodies. And what I'm going to do while you're just taking a little bit longer is add in a few suggestions of darks in areas that I know are ultimately going to be darker. So I know, for example, that under here is going to be just a little bit darker, and so I can put a line in there. I know that underneath this bar is going to be just a little bit darker, so I can add that in. And then this bar is going to be a little darker underneath too, or actually on top probably, as well as underneath on that one. I'm going to add in some dark tone on the sides of the bollards. So I'm accenting the line. If the line drawing is reading very clearly, then the watercolor isn't as important. You can simplify the watercolor. Okay, and I think I'll just leave the line drawing in this. I don't need to take this out, it's fine. So we'll make these just a bit more evident, make them come forward a bit by giving them a bit more information. Let's make this edge just a little stronger. Let's make this one just a little stronger. These guys actually go up through there, and these can be just a wee bit stronger too. This one's coming down here. I want it to look busy around this part. There's a lot of stuff going on. I want to capture that idea of it feeling a little busier. Okay, and this one comes over just a little bit more, so we'll just bring that across. And again, I've simplified this down to something just a little straighter there. Windows are going to be just a bit darker, So I'm going to darken those a bit. And then I'm going to start with the watercolor washes, maybe add just a little bit more ink right at the end. Want that to be just a touch darker. You can have this just a little stronger, this just a little bit darker. Okay, I think we're good to go here now. All right, so a color that seems to work pretty well for this image would be cerulean blue, because I really want something light in the background there. So in the background of this, I'm going to use a little cerulean blue. I'm going to make sure I close up the ink to start with, so I don't knock that over. And I'll just clean off the pen. And now we'll go into some watercolor. All right, so I'm going to use a big juicy brush, a mop brush for this. It's a squirrel brush, it's soft, and it will hold a lot of paint because I don't want a whole lot of detail. And hot press paper takes watercolor differently. It tends to make its own edges. And so that's something you have to be aware of when you use hot press paper. It doesn't work like cold press at all. It has its own mind, if you like. Okay, so let's find the paint here so you can see what I'm doing with that too. And I have a sponge right next to the paint here. So we'll pull that over just a little bit so you can see. There we go. All right, so the first washes are going to be in the sky to give an idea of a background. And I think that to be fairly light. This is a light middle tone, so I can check it against the paper and see how light it is. It could even be just a little bit lighter than that. It doesn't have to have much color in it at all. I'm going to have a touch of cerulean and a touch of cobalt in this sky area, both together. Let's touch more cobalt in there, and that should do it. I'm just going to run that straight across the sky. Now, you can leave clouds if you want to on something like this, but I'm not going to. I'm a little bit careful about leaving this post white. That's one of the few things that's going to stay white in the final image. And you can see how hot press paper is just a little different. I'm using a big juicy brush so I get a flat wash. It's more difficult if you use a smaller brush for hot press. But again, I'm not interested in trying to make it look like a watercolor. I'm just using the watercolor to color a line image. Okay, so I'm not too concerned about pushing it towards a watercolor. Something on the paper there that I'm not quite sure what happened. Let's just tighten that up a little bit. Okay, that should do it. And now we're ready to make the background hills nice and light. Give them a little bit of dimension with cerulean. And I'm also going to have a touch of burnt sienna separately on the other side of the palette here. A little burnt sienna. And a little raw sienna to drop into that along the way. Just a bit more of that. There we go. I'm keeping everything pretty light back here because it's important to get a little feeling of depth. So I'll test that. That should be just about the same as the sky, but it's going to have a slightly different color to it. So it'll stand out a little bit. So this is my background hill. Just a tiny touch darker than the sky, but not much. And I'm going to add in cerulean and drop in just a tiny touch of sienna, the two siennas, to green it down and give it a little feeling of texture. Okay, so that will be fine for that one. All right, the next hill needs to be slightly darker, so just a touch more paint, same idea. And again, I'm not concerned so much about what's happening here on, it's just not quite dark enough, on the in the watercolor. I'm more concerned about the line. So the watercolor is a support for the line. Okay, so I'm thinking in terms of what makes that happen. I need a slightly darker tone there to make the top of this pop out when I paint it light, and the darker tone brings that hill forward just a touch. Just keep that little rough bar area unpainted. And I'm going to drop in just a few of the other colours in there. Just a touch of the brown while it's still wet. And I'm using this big juicy brush so it doesn't dry too quickly on me, just for these large areas. Go back to a smaller brush afterwards. Just a little bit of raw sienna in there to get that greenish feel. And just let the watercolor do what it does, paint itself. That works pretty nicely. Okay. And it also gives just a touch of texture. And that's all we need. Okay, it's a little more difficult on hot press paper to lift things out. So if you make a mistake and you've covered a white where you don't want to cover a white, you should catch it before it dries if you can, because hot press is not quite as forgiving for lifting. Although arches might be just a little more so. Just pull that in to the corner there. Okay, all right, so that's good. And now the next hill, this is just a warm up here. Let's just put a little cool on top of that. Okay. And the next hill, again, coming forward, it's going to be just a little darker. Cerulean, same colors. I'm just using that idea of a background that is similar all the way through here. It might be just a touch too strong. Let's just spread it out a bit. There we go. And color on it. It's bleeding from the one above. It doesn't matter. It's not important. What's important is that it's the right tone, approximately. There we go. A little bit of that. That should work pretty nicely. Let's put a tiny bit more of the warmer tone in there to start to bring that forward a bit more. Okay, so I have a white edge there, and the white edge is not a problem, but later on I can just fill that in if I want to. I'm not going to go in and mess with it now because that's too much. And again, just a little bit further down, I'm going to move to a slightly smaller brush now. Something that's still juicy, but not quite as big as the other one. Okay, a little bit more of the cerulean in there. I'm going to stay with the cerulean idea because the water is more turquoise in this picture, and that way I get a color mix that works and is coordinated throughout the painting. There we go, a little bit of that. So it's just a little raw sienna on top of cerulean, and watercolor paints itself if you let it, wet in wet, so we'll let it do that. And if I need to darken this edge just a little bit to separate those two, I can do that. You can see I've got an edge there where it dried just a bit quickly, so we can look at those and see if that's important when we've finished. Right now it looks more important than it will be eventually. Okay, so we have an edge on the top here and then some sand. Little edge there that isn't quite so dark. And then some sand. Raw sienna is a good colour for that. Well, sienna is a good color for lots of things. Useful color. Okay, that's just a little bit lighter, a touch lighter than the one above. And now we'll use this sandy color in here and in here. And that gives a feeling of that background area. Okay, now we'll add in the same idea on the left-hand side, but this time a touch darker because it's a little closer to us. So I'm going to go with this idea of just a little bit darker. Same colors again. And I'm going to leave a few little gaps on the left-hand side here for a suggestion of some buildings in there. Not quite sure what it is, but it's something going on there. It's not about this, it's about the building. Keep reminding yourself it's not about the background, it's not about making a watercolor, it's more about a line drawing that has watercolor. Okay, so it's really good to just keep that in mind while you're painting. I'll just leave a few more of those little edgy things there to suggest some buildings or something. Come back and look at those later and see what we need to do with those, if anything. Just another little edge there that's a bit darker. And we'll leave a couple of those boats in the water just a bit lighter. So we've got an idea of what might be happening here. Stuff. It's all about stuff. Okay, so now I'm going to add some color to the building. I can't do yet because this is still just a little bit too wet, so I can add some color to the water while I'm waiting for that to dry down a bit. Start with cerulean and add in a little cobalt. I have those two ready to go. The water is going to be just a little bit darker in the foreground, and I'm warmer, a little bit warmer as it comes towards us. So this is the cobalt. I'm going to drop in some cerulean. And we know this is water because of the subject more than anything. It's just a wee bit stronger underneath here and underneath here. Touch of burnt sienna to grey that down just a little bit. A little bit more of that feeling of greyed blue in a few places might be kind of nice, rather than just the straight water. I'm aiming for something that's close to the finished tone of this water in the foreground. The tone that I'm looking for when it's completely finished. You won't have to put too much more color on this. Trying to use relatively horizontal strokes because that's going to give us more of the feeling of water. And I'm just trying to vary the color so it's more interesting. Grey it down just a tiny bit and add in a few. You can add in a few little darker waves later on if we need to. This is going to give us that feeling of that water in that area. Okay, so that's good. So this is what I meant by simplifying the washes. I mean, really, really going down to very little information in the washes. Leave a few whites in there, that's fine. As it goes further back, the water gets just a little bit lighter. So we can add that in now. Some of this water goes through here, so it can go all the way through right now, up to about here. And we'll just leave a little bit of that boardwalk showing there. And it's okay if it gets a little bit lighter back here because that will make it look further away. Doesn't matter if it goes over the dark bollards either because they're going to be darker. So that's going to work on that side. Just a touch more of the cobalt here perhaps for more feeling of a horizontal line there. There we go. That's good. Okay, there's some more water hidden in the foreground here, and it's a mixture of cobalt and cerulean, and the water comes under there. It also comes in this area here, so it's going to be behind those. That's a bit too much cobalt, a bit more cerulean in there, but it's going to be a little darker because it's in that space. So just a bit more in there, and just a few touches in there to capture that. This water can be just a touch darker too, because it's underneath there. Alright, so that's just about all the water that we need, apart from on the left here. And now I'm going to leave some whites here for the boats. Little white shapes, a few little white shapes for the boats. And then I'm going to tighten this up. Always add a few more boats in here later if we allow ourselves not to finish it completely. And the water goes back to about this spot. There we go. Okay, I'm just going to link that together. Make it just a touch lighter back there. Okay, looking good. All right, that just gives us a little feel for what's going on back there. Stuff, activity. Anytime you have light against dark, you're going to have activity. So that's what's happening back there right now. Okay, so we're pretty good with that. That's really simple wash. I'm not too thrilled about this line that's coming down here, so I will fix that by making this just a little bit darker later on. And I'll fill in that white line down there too. In the meantime, we can start working on the roof line. Just push back a little bit of that colour off the roof there. And the roof is going to be burnt sienna and a little raw sienna together. It's a sort of pinkish, brownish tone. And so I'm looking at that type of tone, which is burnt sienna and a little raw sienna perhaps, and a touch of permanent rose. Test that on the paper. It needs to be a bit more yellow than that, just a touch more. There we go, that's more like it. And it should be about a light middle tone, so that might not be quite dark enough. Let's check it. Again, make it just a little bit darker. That's more like it. Remember, it's going to dry down. Always have to remember it's going to dry down lighter than you see it. But it is just a little darker than the hills. So I was interested in tone and how tone works, because most of the time that's what's important in the painting, is how light or how dark the colour is, not so much the colour. Okay, that gives us enough information in that. I don't think we have that colour anywhere else particularly, so we'll Move on now. A lot of the building can stay white, but we do have some nice shadows on the areas that are not lit. And so I'm going to use a grey made with cobalt and burnt sienna to capture that. I have a little bit too much yellow in my brush. Let me just try that again. Cobalt and burnt sienna. That's better. And we'll get a blue-grey, sort of fairly soft blue-grey with that. And we'll check it on the paper. And knowing that that's going to dry down just a little bit lighter, that might be just a wee bit too dark for that shadow. So just a touch of water to make that just a little bit lighter. I think that's going to work better. So everything that's in shadow can be in shadow with that big one big wash. Okay, so one big wash over here. And this unit here is in shadow too, but I'm going to treat that separately. I'll put the shadow on the side here. I'm going to treat it a little separately. And this shadow comes all the way to the edge of the building. So this is the idea for line and wash. You're going to use, I'm going to do a slightly darker tone on top of that, but I'll do it on top. You're going to use the idea of shadows, a single wash and then shadows on top to make everything work. And that will work the best way for this idea of line and wash. There's a shadow that comes down here from the bar, and it goes down right about there. Okay. There's a shadow that's on the side of this, same tone, same color. There's a little shadow on the inside of this, and a shadow there. There's a shadow on the edge of the post here. Might be safer to use a slightly smaller brush for that. There we go. Okay, where else do we have shadows in there? We have shadows in here. Next to this, there's a shadow on the back of this area. This post is casting a shadow. And there's a lot of shadow in this area here. So put a little shadow in there. Shadow down there. This little thing is casting a shadow on the side of the wall. And that's about it. I think there's shadow on this side of the railing. And a little bit along here too. And the boat on the side here has shadow on this side. Pretty much all of this side is in shadow. A little bit back there. Put some shadow back there. I'll do the windows separately, a little bit darker. And there's a little shadow coming around the side here as well, just a touch of shadow coming in there. You can use some of the shadow color, but with more water, to paint the surface of this, keeping it light, relatively. I'll blot that just a little bit so it's lighter. And this one here, just the same idea, it's just a little bit of light on that. And okay, and I did find another space for that roof color here. Space on there. It's a very similar colour to the rough bar image too, so I'll just take a little orange from the palette and put that in with a touch of burnt sienna. There we go. So now we have that working pretty nicely. Now we have to get in some darks. Let me just add some colour to the boat first of all. I'm going to use Prussian blue for that and a touch of burnt sienna to dull it down just a little bit. So that's Prussian blue over here with just a touch of burnt sienna. And that's going to be pretty much all of the side of the boat. This little accent of colour on the side there that we'll save. Goes up to this edge around the top there, and it kind of softens out at this edge a little bit and becomes lighter. You might have to put a shadow on that when that's dry, so we'll just leave that for the moment. Just make sure this front stays just a little bit lighter. There we go. Okay, so we're good to go on that, and now we can use that same shadow colour on the edge of the roof now that this is dry enough. And I'll come back in and do a slightly darker one a bit later, but let's put that in for the moment. Should have added that. And on the front there, just a tiny little bit of shadow in here. And a bit of shadow on the outside edge of that one. Okay. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the darks all the way down the bottom here. I'm going to add a big wash that goes through that takes care of most of those darks. So burnt sienna this time, ultramarine blue, because I want to go a little darker. Burnt sienna and ultramarine for a dark brown. And I need to get that colour in and colour most of what's in there. I'll need a slightly lighter version, so let me bring it over here and add a touch of water to that and a little bit more of the darker version. So this is the idea again of simplifying the washes, not painting every single thing that you see separately necessarily, but connecting things together. So in here I can see that there's stuff going on. Probably could have put a little bit of water in this one too, but there's something yellow on the side, on the back there, that I can add in as an accent. And I'm looking at the shapes that I see and just filling in a lot of those underneath the bars. Okay, with this and then a slightly lighter brown in a few places because it's not all exactly the same. And we'll come back, and a lot of that line is going to show through on this afterwards when it dries. So we know that there's all sorts of things going on under here, but we can't really see what it is because it's all in shadow. So let's make it that way, and that pops the boat out a bit too. And the shadow goes, yeah, pretty much all the way through. I'm going to lighten up that top one just a little bit, so I'll go up to about here with that darker shadow. And these posts are all hidden in that idea of shadow down here. A little bit of a suggestion of posts there and there and there. But everything else is pretty much in that shadow. So we'll keep that dark. Over here, get the shadow areas in first, and then we'll deal with those posts afterwards. And this goes down here, there's another one coming down there. A little bit of a lighter brown in this area because it's catching the light inside there. So we'll add in just a touch more of that feeling of lighter brown. So this is the essence of the light and dark tone that we're looking for here. There's a little bit of orange in there that kind of picks up the edge of that of that ladder that we're looking at. And you see a little bit of it down there too. So I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's there, so, and it's useful and it's interesting, so we'll use it. Okay, now the darker tones on the side of the bollards be kind of good to put in. Just a little bit of a darker tone to start with. And we can add in a lighter tone later. Or we might just leave them. We'll see how it looks when it's dry. On the screen I have to fill in all these little whites because they pop out like crazy. So any little tiny dot of white is going to be jumping out at you and saying that shouldn't be there. We kind of have to get rid of those. Right. Dark under there. And that first is okay, those are okay. This one needs just a little bit of dark going back there. That's just a bit too wide. Pull that back a bit, there we go. And here, background. So now it's just a case of linking everything up again. And then we can go back in and add in just a few details that will finish everything off. This area here is the lighter brown going through here. So we just want it to be just a little bit less strong than we see. Technically, some of that is the building coming down into that area. So it could be just a little bit more grey too. Just a touch. That should work. And now on this side, we'll fill in the bars. They're a bit lighter. They've got a little orange in them. So a little bit more burnt sienna in the mix there. To brighten and lighten those up a bit. Just a bit more water, I think, on that. And there's one more grey toned board up there. Now in between those, everything gets just a bit darker. So this is a way of simplifying all of that complicated stuff that is there. Simplify it down to lights and darks. Oops, I missed a piece there. There we go. Missed a piece of light in the middle there. Okay, so that's part of the building up there, but there's another piece of wood that goes up here that I didn't put in, that we should put in. And anything that's part of the building would be shadow at this point, if it's behind all of these, so that shadow can go in there, a little bit of the water feel can go in there too. There's some sort of board panel here, not quite sure what it is again, but we'll give it a little bit of colour to add interest to the front of that, using cerulean again for that. Okay, a light tone on the side of these, very light, just dry brush on the side of these. A touch of dry brush. A bit more of that dark going up there. And make sure that we don't have too many little poppy whites jumping out there. Okay, I think we're good to go on that. So that gives us an idea of what's going on in this area. I'm just going to make these posts a bit darker, and then we'll be ready to stop on this one. Just pull this post down just a bit more so it's a little bit more definition in this area of what's going on, and a bit more variety of tone. Okay. We can add a bit more ink in there too if we want to later on. I'm going to use Prussian blue and burnt sienna for the windows. That's a good window color for just about any subject. Put that in the windows here too. And leave a little bit of white in the middle, just to vary it. Okay, there's a bit more brown going on back here. Probably won't show in the final picture, but I'll just put a tiny bit of orange on this little goodie back there. It's always fun to add touches of colour to boats because it shows up so nicely on the surface of whatever you're doing. There we go, a little bit of a dark trim on that edge. And down at the bottom it's a bit more black, so add just a bit more burnt sienna to that same Prussian to get the same dark feel down here. The little colour on the side is red, but it's not bright red because it's in shadow, so it needs to be toned down just a little bit. Those little touches make it more interesting. There's some sort of logo on there that I'm not quite sure about. We could lift that out, just again for interest. Okay. So we need some more ocean colour back here. Just a tiny touch behind the boat and in between those railings. And everything else is stuff, so it can be grey stuff leading out of the picture. We're not quite sure what it is, but that's going to give us that finish on that side. Grey on the back here, little shadow on the back of that. Kind of interesting. And now we can use that same dark turquoise colour for the strong dark that's underneath here. And a little bit of shadow underneath there too. So that same colour, I'm just going to pull it down just a little bit to shadow that edge a touch. And pull this down into that darker area and under the edge of the boat on this side too. Okay, we're almost there. And to use that same turquoise, actually no, it's a blue-grey, cobalt blue-grey again for a few accents on the building. So we're getting close to being finished with this one. So this edge will be a blue-grey. And the edges around the windows, just a little bit more too. Just a touch more of colour in there. It's the edge around the door. This little unit here is yellow, but it will be in the shadow because it's in the shadow already. Okay, so now we need to make the rocks down here just a touch darker. Maybe just a little browner. Let's connect those together a bit and touch more dark water just under the edge there. I'm going to take my brush and do a little wash of the cerulean on that mountain that is just a touch of burnt sienna in there. This edge right here, just to darken it a little bit. On that side. Okay, and that separates it from the hill behind. I do the same thing on this one. I'm going to lose that white edge there too. Just darken it slightly. There we go. Okay, I'm going to go back in while that's drying down just a bit. Oh, one more shadow here that I forgot. This little one on the side here should be a shadow. And another post. Something just a little darker there. Okay, that's working. That's working okay. This good detail on this on this side here. Little edge. Slightly darker tone up here behind this. Show it separate. Couple of little red accents on here. A red orange for this. There's a couple of little tiny goodies on the side here that we could add in there. And the boat's going to be just a little bit darker. It's a bit too light now. It's not in the shadows right now. There we go. I'll tighten up these areas around the edge of the boat. To make that better. A bit of dark in here because it's too light. It should be in shadow in that area. And that should be in shadow. These under here, just a bit more shadow. And I'm going to straighten up that shadow edge just a wee bit on the building there. Just a touch more of that. A darker tone on the edge of this. Bit of a darker shadow on the side of that. Okay, so in here, I don't have enough definition right now, so I'm going to put in a little bit more dark to push back some of those areas and let some of the lighter ones show through just a bit more. So right in here, we're going to have this little post be darker. And we're going to have another one coming in here that will pop out that colour just a little bit. A bit more dark going in here. This is all so much in shadow, we don't know what's there. All we know is it's shapes. And so I'm just making a few shapes that seem to fit in there. That define it just a bit more. And there's a bar that comes down there. That in as well. You can see that a little bit more. And then this one too. Water under here is just a little bit too dark, so we'll lift that out a bit. And that will lift some of the other areas a touch too. So you can see just a bit more interest in there. Darken the back of that. And again, next to this, just a tiny bit more interest within those areas. So I'll just lift out a little bit of stuff going on. So apart from filling in a few little whites that are still popping out, like these guys, we're getting pretty close on this one. Edge of this needs a tone, and I've simplified this area around here a lot. I'm just going to go back in now and add a little bit more line to the fence and pop that out a bit more. And this little area, I can possibly make a light line from the boat down to here where it's by lifting it with my flat brush. It doesn't work quite as well on this paper. We'll try and get a slightly lighter line down so we get the feeling of the boat being docked there. I'll fill that back in a moment when that's finished. So in here, we're seeing just a little bit more of that. Yeah, I think we're good to go on that. Just a touch of shadow on the side of this. There we go. And a touch more shadow in here. Just on the side of that one. And just a little bit of detail on this. On these edges here. I think I used blue-grey for those, so let me go back and use the same colour. A bit more of a shadow in there. Got that on that side. I think we're good to go on that. Okay, a touch more shadow on that. And a little black goodie up on here. Or something along the lines of that. And there should be a touch of water in between the edge of that and the building. Okay, so one more little touch with a little bit of ink and tighten up a couple of things. I think we're pretty close to being finished on this one. This isn't quite as detailed because of the time, but it's close. So I'm going to go in here and just darken that railing just a little bit. Make that pop out just a bit more. And we'll darken this one too, just a touch more. Let that pop out. Okay. Darken the windows just a wee bit. This is good. This area here shouldn't be white. It should be nice light grey. There we go. Okay, just a few more lines in the ocean. Connect these up just a bit more back here. Nice edge on that. And make sure the edges on these are dark enough. And there's just a little bit of extra white there to get rid of. Okay, I think I'm going to stop on that and say I think that's pretty close to being finished. There's one little thing here that I'm not quite happy with. It doesn't have enough water in there, watercolor in there. So we'll add a little bit more of that in that area. Okay, let's put a mat on that and see how it looks. And I think we're done with that. Move it around just a little bit so it fits nicely. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed. There's still a few little whites here that I can see that are probably popping out on the screen that I probably would fill in later. Little touches of white. Thank you so much for joining me, and thanks again for Central Coast Watercolor Society for inviting me to do this. I really appreciate it, and I hope you've enjoyed it. It'll be up on YouTube in about a week, so you can come back and revisit if you'd like to. And I hope to see you again. So until next time, bye for now.